the prophets, the goodly fellowship of souls, who spake God's word with faith and boldness, who blessed the poor and made the wounded whole.
Oh, he fell upon his knees and cried, I am not one of these.
He waited till another band of shining ones drew nigh. They entered into heaven with a hallelujah cry. He asked again, who are these? Can you tell me whence they came? He seemed to see the answer in a burning tongue of flame. These are the company of martyrs, the mighty fellowship of saints, who knew our Lord and walked beside him, who ran the holy race and did not faint. Oh, he fell upon his knees and cried, I am not one of these.
Then suddenly a multitude was heard from far away. Their voices rang with songs of joy, like children at their play. He saw Rahab,
David,
Mary Magdalene, and Paul, and the thief who died by Jesus was the one who led them all. Who are these? He almost shouted at the angels. These are the sinners saved by grace, the host of them who call upon the Savior, washed in blood and justified by faith. And oh, he leaped up from his knees. Oh, I can go in with these. I can go in, for my heart is free from sin. I've been washed in the blood, everlasting life to win. I can rejoice, I can lift up my voice, I can sing, and I can go in. Oh, we thought that there could be no hallelujahs and no cries for this lowly band of people by the world despised. But as the scenes of heaven opened up before his eyes, he saw the martyrs and the prophets and the host of heaven rise. And they sang, I can go in, for my heart is free from sin. I've been washed in the blood, everlasting life to win. I can rejoice, I can lift up my voice, I can sing, and I can go in. I can rejoice, I can lift up my voice, I can sing, and I can go in. I can go in.
Genesis 16 tonight. Genesis chapter number 16. If I were to ask you to quote from me Proverbs chapter number 3 and verse 5, most of us in this room would be able to do that, I think. In fact, let's see if you can do that off the bat without even looking. Proverbs 3:5. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart and lean not unto thine own understanding. That's verse 5, just verse 5. Okay? just verse 5. I know we always put 5 and 6 together. But I want you to catch that last part of verse 5. Lean not unto thine own understanding. When we're walking by faith, we have a tendency to want to begin to lean on our own understanding when walking by faith doesn't work the way we think it should. I'm guilty. I don't know if you are, but I'm guilty. Abraham and Sarah in chapter 15 were given a promise. The promise was this, that they would have a son, and God was going to provide that for them. Between chapter 15 and chapter 16, there is a 10-year gap. For 10 years, God has not answered. Abraham has gone from being 75 to being 85. Sarah has gone from being 65 to being 75. Now, you do the math. Most everybody in this room who are in that age bracket, you're not hoping to have a kid next year. Right? If you're 10 years under that age bracket, you're hoping not to have a kid next year. And probably those of us in our 40s are not hoping to have a kid come along next year either. We understand with this here, and I understand that, again, things were a little different back then as far as age-wise goes, but trust me, they're still at that age, they were like, okay, we're done. Look at chapter 16 and verse number 1 with me. The Bible tells us this here. Now, Sarai, Abram's wife, bare him no children. She had an handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said unto Abram, Behold now, the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go in unto my maid. It may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. And Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. God made a promise. God made a promise. But the promise had not been realized yet. Oftentimes, whenever we believe God has made a promise or God has led us to do such and such, if He does not come through for us in a certain time frame, we get to wondering, God, where are you? God, have you led me in the wrong place? God, did you... We don't want to call God a liar. I forget, I've just lost the name, but I think it might have been Jeremiah that said, God, thou didst deceive me. We don't call him a liar, but we say, you tricked me. Jeremiah said, you tricked me into being this preacher, and look what has got me. You tricked me. You know, sometimes we feel that way, and that's where Abraham and Sarah are. We can understand why they're a little bit reluctant with things, but there's some things here about this here I want us to point out tonight, and I just simply titled the sermon tonight as this here as being faith failures. Faith failures. Because there are times when we fail in our faith. I want us to look at some things specific to Abraham and Sarah this evening, and it is in particular in their situation, but it can easily happen in our own lives as well. I want you to see here that as the first thing that that caused them to fail in their faith in this regard was this here, they were getting direction from the wrong place. Direction from the wrong place. Notice again with me at verse number 1, chapter 16. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bare him no children. She had an handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said unto Abram. There is a problem here, is that Sarah decided to take the lead. Sarah decided to take the lead. She was still barren. She had this handmaid from Egypt, and I read this from one man who said, don't be surprised the things that you pick up when you're out of God's will, they turn out to be stumbling blocks as you're trying to travel down the road of faith. Hagar should have never been in with the camp. She came because they went to Egypt, and Egypt was not in the will of God. And while they were down in Egypt, they picked up this young lady as a servant to Sarah, but now here it is. Sarah's like, I can't have kids, and I'm too old for this here. And so, Abram, there's a problem here. And so, Abram, here's what you need to do. And Abraham, and she begins to, she begins to wear the britches in the family. She begins the ones who's giving the orders now in the home. And I want you to notice some things here about what Sarah does. Look at verse 2. Sarah said unto Abram, behold now, notice the next few words. The Lord hath restrained me. Who's at fault? Yeah. All of a sudden, they've been traveling on this road of faith, and they've been doing okay, but they've come to a crossroads again, and instead of them just choosing to continue to trust God, well, it hasn't happened the way He said it was. No, He didn't say that you're going to have a son in 10 years, did He? He just said you're going to have a son. That's all He promised. Now, it sure seemed, because, physically speaking, I don't know if Sarah went to biology class or not in high school, but she knew this isn't going to happen. And so there's a problem here. And so she begins it, and her first charge, if you will, was against God. The Lord hath restrained me. Boy, we got to be careful in assuming that, God, you got to work on my timetable. God, you got to do things whenever I say things are supposed to be done. God, you got to do this here. Lord, I did this for you. Now you need to do this for me. Oh, that's not the way God works. God is not our servant. God is not to come and do our beck and call, and whenever we want things done, He comes and does. No. He is God. Amen. He's the one who hath made us, and not we ourselves. And so we need to be reminded of that here. And Sarah begins by pointing the finger at God and saying, God has put me in this position. This is all of God's fault. At times we place the blame on the Lord for our faith being weak, when in reality we're just letting our flesh have rule in our lives. And that's where Sarah's at. Now, can we blame her? I'm not real quick to blame her because of this here. I have a tendency to do the same thing. I know my flesh, and all we're seeing is that Sarah's flesh is playing out like all of our flesh will play out when it is not on the altar. My flesh is not on the altar. My flesh is having say, guess what? I get a little upset with God. God, why aren't you doing this? God, why aren't you doing that? God, why? And we begin to question. And I can tell. I can tell when it happens. There are certain things in my life that didn't go the way I thought they should. And whenever I start getting a little frustrated with God, I start bringing up things. God, why didn't you do this? God, why didn't you do that? You let this and this. And I get that way. And I know whenever that's happening in my mind, I'm here to the back of my mind, I don't know it. Maybe it's the Holy Spirit saying, somebody's alive again. I guess I'll just back out. And that's what's going on. Our faith failures often begins by this here saying, God, and we begin pointing the finger. That's one of the amazing things about Job. Is Job didn't blame God. Job wanted to have an audience with God to find out why is this going on, but he never said, God, you're the whole reason. He maintained his integrity. It's an amazing thing about Job. Why did Sarah come up with this plan? Well, her plan was to bring her servant Hagar to Abram to have him have a child with her. That was a common practice in that day. If you had a servant and you and your husband could not have a child, then what would happen is they would often take their servant, the lady would take the servant and bring her to her husband, and they would have a child together, and then the child would be the lady of the house and the husband's. It would be their seed then. So it was a cultural practice. And again, we saw this before. They were trying to use culture before. God, you can take my servant Eliezer. He was born in my house, and technically, he's my... No. It's going to come from you, Abraham. Okay, Sarah says, well, we've waited 10 years. It hasn't happened. So if it's going to come from You, he just said you, Abraham. He didn't say us. He said you. So here's my servant girl, and you can have a child through her. See, we're not careful. We like to throw in these things here and try to take loopholes and see if we can't give God an out. God doesn't need outs for us. He can do what He needs to. Notice she said in verse 2, it may be. What does that indicate? It indicates a lack of faith in God's plan. It may be. No, faith is living without scheming. I'll say that again for you. Faith is living without scheming. We don't need to help God out. God can take care of everything. But here's the thing, Abraham didn't do anything to push this back. Abraham, you're the man of the house. God structured the home in such a way that the man is to be the leader in the home. But notice here, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, a maid, the Egyptian, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. Wait, did Abraham and Sarah quit being husband and wife? So now we're going to break God's plan completely. What was God's plan in the garden? One man and a harem. No, not a harem. He only took one rib out, and He made only one woman. One man, one woman for life. That was God's plan. And by the way, it doesn't matter what anybody else says and how anybody wants to take God's plan and rearrange it. It doesn't, just because they want to call it marriage doesn't make it marriage. Right. The only marriages that are going on are those who are doing things according to God's plan. There's none of this other junk that's going on in our world today. It doesn't matter who the government says is married. That doesn't condone it. It's what God says, and it's one man and one woman. That is God's plan. That is His design for us. And so, as He gives this plan, He lays down, He tells the man, He said, look, whenever you need to leave your mom and dad's home, leave your father and mother, and then cleave unto your wife, and then they shall be one flesh. So when God said to Abraham, Abraham, out of thy bowels shall a seed come, then who was He intending to be the woman in this relationship? Sarah, because what? They were one flesh. God did not need to distinguish this Abraham and Sarah thinking that, well, He's going to run off and take somebody else. No. God knew Abraham and Sarah. That's who I intended. Because you two are married, you two are one flesh, that's who I'm going to work through. Well, it may be. Doesn't mean that as a man of the house that you refuse to listen to your wife. However, it does make you the one who is supposed to be leading the family and making those right decisions. Abraham knew the right decisions to make. However, notice what he does here. He hearkens unto his wife. In the verse 2, and Abraham hearkened to the voice of Sarai. There may have been a justifying thought in Abram's mind. And, going back to that, well, he did just say out of my bowels in Genesis 15:4. But in God's eyes, they were one flesh. He said, that's who I'm going to use. And so Sarah was the one who insisted on this plan and caused it to take place. She was pushing for it. And Abraham, instead of standing his ground saying, no, God said, and this is what we're going to do. We're going to trust God. I don't know. It doesn't make sense to me either, but we're going to trust God. By the way, it's going to be another 15 years. It's going to be another 15 years. But God said, I want you to trust me because I've got a plan for you. And so they decide to go ahead with their own scheme. And he goes into her in verse 4, and she conceived. And when she saw, who's that she? That is Hagar. When she saw that she conceived, her mistress, Sarah, was despised in her eyes. All of a sudden, now we've gone from having the wrong direction, and now we've got division in the home. All of a sudden, what was a nice place? It was a place of tranquility. It was a place to come home, and there was peace. And how many of us enjoy going home and having peace? That's what we want. We don't want to go home from work and come home to a war zone. We want to come home to peace, right? So why would you do anything to upset that in your life? Why would you do anything to cause strife in the home? But this was a blatant thing to invite strife in. And here it is, Hagar has this child. She's pregnant and she's going to have this. And now, this is not good. Notice this here. He went into her, and she conceived, I'm sorry, in verse 3 there, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. I want you to catch that. In Abram and Sarai's sight, Hagar was his wife. I just want you to hold on to that little tidbit. We're going to come back to it here in just a moment. She's pregnant, and now she's looking over here at Sarah and saying, look at me. And she's sticking her gut out. Look at me. And she's rocking around and saying, what about you? Oh, you can't. So and she's great with child. And she's like, look who could have a baby and who couldn't. And all of a sudden, man, Sarah is like, claws are out. Game is on. Verse 5, and Sarai said to Abram, here we go. My wrong be upon thee. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to interpret that. Every man in this room can interpret that scripture without any problem. My wrong be upon thee. This is all your fault. And she is mad. And we all know happy wife, happy life. And we know the opposite of that is true too. Sarah's anger is so worked up, but listen, when you follow the wisdom of the world, you end up warring just like the world. If you want the peace of God in your home, you got to do things God's way. And God's way was very clear. War had broken out between Sarah and Hagar, and it was going to be involved. Abraham's caught right in the middle of all this stuff going on, and it's going to get nasty now. Sarah begins by blaming Abraham. It was not his idea, but he did not stop things from happening. And can I just say, she was right. It was Abraham's fault. If Abraham would have simply said, no, I am married to you, and God said He would give it to us, and so we're going to wait on God's time, we'll be patient, then there's no strife. Yeah. But because Abraham would not stand his ground, there's strife. Ladies, can I just encourage you, when your husband listens and he takes in what you're saying, but he just simply says, I don't think that's the wise thing to do. I think we should trust him. Trust him. You say, well, he's not a very spiritual person. I'm just telling you, just trust him. God has placed him as the head of the home. It's amazing how many times God will give discernment to your husband if you will just submit to his leadership. I don't know of a good husband, of a good Christian family, who the husband is going to his man cave and saying, let's see, how can I destroy my family today? There's not a single husband, a good Christian, God-fearing, God-loving husband that's doing that. I believe in my heart of hearts, every husband wants what's best for his family, for his wife, for his children. He has that at his heart. And he may not be the best, but he's trying to do what he can. So be there ready to encourage. Hey, have the talks, if you will. Sarah could have come and said, we're not having a baby. What do you think about Hagar? And Abraham's response should have said, God said it was going to, I don't understand, but God said, and that should have stopped everything. But instead, she said, no, I want you to take my servant girl. And he said, well, okay, that's acceptable, so we'll go ahead and do that. And well, now she's got a baby on the way, and it's all your fault. You're right, it is. It's Abraham's fault because he didn't stand up. So men, take the stand and say, this is what is right, and this is what this is biblical, and this is what we're going to do. But there's also as much blame that goes on Abraham, there's as much blame that goes on Sarah. Sarah, you're the one who had the plan. You're the one who had the idea. Abraham wasn't over there in his sitting in his Cracker Barrel rocker on the front porch thinking, this ain't working out too well. I wonder what Sarah would think about me taking her little servant girl. That never crossed his mind. But it was his wife who had the plan. So before she goes and starts saying, hey, it's all your fault, big boy, It's just as much as your fault too, little lady. And we need to be reminded of that. Yes, there's blame to go. There's equal blame to go around to both there. But it was simply this here. I don't get ahead of myself here. Notice here, he said, my wrong be upon thee. I have given my maid into thy bosom. And when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between me and thee. That's a spiritual way to make things, isn't it? If the Lord came down and judged between them, the two of them, he'd have said, you're wrong and you're wrong. Yeah. You should have never had an affair with that lady, and you should have never put him up to it. There was equal blame to go around. So what is Sarah's solution? Her solution is this: hurt Hagar. Look at it. But Abram said unto Sarah, behold, thy maid is in thy hand, do to her as it pleaseth thee. And when Sarai dealt hardly with her, that means she was rough. She was, you get down there, you scrub that floor. You do this here. She just all of a sudden became just the stepmother and the, Cinderella. That's who she became. It was rough. And that was Sarah's response on how to deal with it here, as she was taking out all of her anger on her when she was actually the reason this was going on. Can I just remind you of this? Galatians chapter 6. The principles in Galatians 6 verse 7 through 9 still applied back in the Old Testament. Be not deceived, God is not mocked. For whatsoever man soweth, that shall he also reap. If he sow to the flesh corruption, he shall have the flesh reap corruption. If he sow to the flesh, or sow to the Spirit, he shall reap life everlasting. Be not weary in well-doing, for in due season ye shall reap if ye faint not. Keep doing what is right. Abraham and Sarah, you've been doing so well, you've been doing so well, you've been doing so well. And now all of a sudden you're going to stop and you're going to reap to the flesh. Sow to the flesh, and you're going to reap. You're going to reap. So what happens? Hagar's only solution is this: run. Run from the problem. She leaves. Verse 6, she leaves. So she fled from her face. And the angel of the Lord comes out and meets her there. And he says, what are you doing out here? Why are you fleeing from her? And of course she says, she's being mean to me. He's like, look, that's no way to handle the problem here. You need to go back and you need to take care of things here. God wanted Hagar to go back. Why? Because Hagar, you're not the problem. I need Abraham and Sarah to deal with their sin. And Hagar, you're the embodiment of their sin. That was tough. But I like this too about our God. Even in this horrible story, there's no other way to put it. It's a horrible story. There's a glimpse of mercy. See, what's that glimpse of mercy? Here's a little slave girl who's brought out of a heathen land, who's been mistreated by God's people. And the first time, catch this, the first time the angel of the Lord shows up. Who's he showing up to? He's not showing up to Abraham. He's not showing up to some mighty man of the faith. He's showing up to a little slave girl who's been mistreated and mishandled and abused by people of God. Aren't you glad that God doesn't say, oh, I'm sorry, you're not worth my time? Even the one that we wouldn't expect an Egyptian girl to get the first visit from the angel of the Lord, but she did. God comes down to her and gives her some things here. Here's what he says. Here's your responsibility, Hagar. Your responsibility is this, verse 9. Return to thy mistress and submit thyself under her hands. Wow. Can I just say wow? Who's the authority? Sarah. Who's abusing you, and she's mistreating you, so you have the right to run. God says, no, you need to go back, you need to submit. Well, we need to learn how to submit again We need to learn humility, and that's her responsibility. But God gives her a promise. So I'm going to multiply you. I'm going to give you a son. I've heard your voice. He makes all these promises here. Now, look down at verse 13. She called the name, and she called the name of the Lord that spake unto her, Thou, God, seest me. She makes a memorial there in the desert, a well. In verse 14, the well was called Beer Lahai Roi. Thou, God, seest me. What a precious thing for that young lady. She returns. She submitted herself to Sarah like God told her to. That was a hard situation, wasn't it? But she did what she was supposed to. By the way, she had more faith in God than what Abraham and Sarah had at this time. If God told you to return to an abusive relationship, would you go back? That's tough, isn't it? I mean, God did not say you're going to go back and Sarah's going to be all fixed. No. She had to go back. Now, I don't know how Sarah reacted to her coming back, but she did what she was supposed to from God. Notice there, verse 15, and Hagar bare Abram a son, and Abram called his son's name, which Hagar bare Ishmael. And Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bare Ishmael to Abram, and Sarah was nice to her for the rest of her life. Not there, is it? But isn't that what we expect? I did what God told me to do, now everything's going to be fine. God never promised to fix the problems. Faith goes on trusting God regardless if problems get fixed or not. George MacDonald said this, and I found this very interesting in this particular setting. He said this, in whatever man does without God, he must fail miserably. But I can go with that. But there's a little more to the quote, though. He goes on to say this. He said, or succeed more miserably.
Yeah.
When I fail at doing my own thing, I'm miserable. But when I succeed in doing my own thing, I'm more miserable. Because still God's not with me. Isn't that the truth? The Bible tells us in Romans chapter 14, verse 23, for whatsoever is not of faith is sin. Abraham, you went in unto Hagar, and it was not of faith. It is sin. Abraham would have to get right with the Lord. At some point he does. We're not told when he does, but he does get right with the Lord again. And he has to because of what God will do in the next chapter. But can I warn us here tonight, as we're walking down the road of faith and we come across those times when it looks like, God, where are you? And we're wondering where He's at. That's not the time to come up with our own plan. Right. Don't bail on God. Abraham and Sarah had followed God for some 10 to 15 years at this point. They've been following God, been doing what He's told them to do, been faithful, if you will, to do. But all of a sudden they've had enough. We all come to that point. We all come to the point, whatever, we've been doing what we're supposed to do, and we've been faithful, and then all of a sudden we hit that roadblock. And we've got to make a choice. Either we continue trusting God to get us through a tough time, or we go off and we try to do our own thing and we make things a whole lot worse. Yeah. We never make it better doing our own thing. Right. Never. And that's an important thing for us to grab hold of. 1 John chapter 1, verse 9, we all know it. But can I tell you, it's true for us, those of us who are saved. We fail. You fail in your walk with the Lord. You fail. You mess up. You lack faith. You make the wrong choice. You do the wrong thing. But if we confess our sin, He's faithful and just to forgive us our sin and to cleanse from all unrighteousness. God will still use Abraham. Aren't you glad? I'm glad because I'm saved today because God still chose to use Abraham. Because they would have Isaac, who would have Jacob, who would have Judah, who would have all those others, until we finally got down to Matthew 1 and Jesus would be born. It was from the tribe of Judah, who was the grandson or great-grandson of Abraham. And his grandpa was Isaac, not Ishmael. God still used him. So yes, we fail, we falter, we mess up, but that's where when we confess our sin, God says, you do what you're supposed to do, and I'll be faithful to, and I'm just in doing it too, to cleanse you. He did for Abraham, He'll do it for you. Be careful. Because whenever the hard things come at us and things don't go according to plan, it's easy for us to question. It's easy for us to question. We're out of